Welcome everybody to the next session of our summit. Today we're presenting mental health, which is obviously on the top of everybody's mind, and that's going to be presented by Adam Hall, who's the Talent and Reward Leader in Australasia for Willis Towers Watson. Willis is also our sponsor, so thank you to both Adam and Willis today for this session. So I'm sure many of you have attended a few of these sessions now, but I'll just go through the housekeeping. For the Zoom features, this is being recorded today and it'll appear on the RIMS Australasia website after the session. All cameras and microphones are turned off, so just please ensure they stay off to avoid any disruption to the session. We'll be using the question and answer at the end of the session, and Adam suggested that you can ask the questions directly at the end. So I'll try and allow about 10 minutes for questions, because I think this is a popular topic, so there'll probably be a few questions. So I think that's all the housekeeping. So I'll just read through Adam's experience. So Adam is a director and leader of the Australian Talent and Reward line of business for Willis Towers Watson. He's responsible for the development and delivery of consulting work and leading the team across employee insights, executive compensation, talent and reward practices. In his consulting work, Adam leads clients' projects across culture change, employee experience, future of work, job levelling, and merger and acquisition integration. Adam is the past leader of the Australian Employee Insights practice and held roles in Australia and the UK, and has undertaken work for clients across Asia Pacific. Adam's passionate about ongoing research and innovation, with a particular interest in the development and measurement of well-being. So Adam, I'm sure that you've got some very interesting insights for us today, considering the experience we've all been going through since early March. So please proceed.
Thanks, Kathy, and hello everyone virtually. It's great to be with you today. So before I get going, I did want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I am living and working on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Today, I want to cover a range of things with you and hopefully then obviously have some time to discuss a topic that's become really very central for all organisations, even if it wasn't their driving focus prior to that. So I want to touch on a little bit of sort of the basics, background. What do we mean when we talk about mental health? And why do we in Willis Towers Watson prefer to talk about wellbeing more broadly than just mental health? What should you focus on when you're thinking about the mental health and wellbeing of your employees? We obviously cannot have this conversation without talking about COVID-19 and the impacts that we've seen, and I'll share some of the research we've been doing around employer actions and employee experiences that have been impacted. And then look at how we think about working with organisations to understand wellbeing more holistically, and then craft a way of developing strategy and intervention to improve the wellbeing and performance of their organisation. And then I just want to end up by posing some of the thinking that we've been doing around how to think differently about people risk. And so just a teaser at the end, and really be interested in getting your reactions to that point of view that we're developing with my colleagues in our workplace risk team and in our health and benefits consulting area, thinking about sort of holistic view of the people risk environment. So I always have a lot of content, so I'll try and move through reasonably quickly so we have a lot of time for questions. So I did want to start though a bit definitionally because we talk about mental health a lot. And we talk about well-being, but really what do we mean when we say those words? What is it that people understand? And it's really important to understand that there's been quite a significant shift in the last 10 to 15 years in the thinking about mental health. So what I'm sharing with you here is, I guess, the development of the way we have thought about mental health. Historically, when we say mental health, people think about it sort of a continuum. So you're healthy at one end and you're mentally unwell or mentally ill at the other. But about 15 years ago, Corey Keyes developed a way of thinking about mental health that actually moved those two things off the same continuum and looked at mental illness, the presence or absence of mental illness, and the presence or absence of mental health as existing on two axes. And this is really important because it starts to recognize that you can be in different states of these four quadrants, and they're not fixed. So typically, when we used to think about mental health, we thought about mental illness. So that's a diagnosed mental illness, DSM-4 criteria. And so those people have, clinical depression, anxiety, OCD, some other diagnosed mental illness. And then there are people at the other end who have no diagnosed illness. However, we also recognize that there are people who can not have a diagnosed mental illness, but still not be functioning well from a mental health perspective. As opposed to others who are coping very well with their daily lives, they're able to be productive and thrive. And so we end up there with this view that has these four quadrants. And so the bottom right-hand side here, we have people who have mental health issues and are not coping well. The bottom left. They have a diagnosed illness, and they have some challenging consequences as a result of that illness. And on the bottom right there, you have no mental illness, but struggling to function effectively. So may not have depression or anxiety disorder, but work stress is causing significant loss of function and well-being. And at the top, we have those people with a mental illness but are functioning well. So they may be on medication, they may be using CBT, they may be using some other way to enable them to perform well in their daily lives. And then on the top right, obviously, we have people who don't have a mental illness and are functioning very well. And this is really an important shift in the way we think about it, because it changes very much the way we design intervention, because it also says that we don't just focus on mental illness, but we focus on functioning, and it mirrors much more the way we think about physical injury and physical and disability, where just because someone has a limitation does not mean that they are not able to function effectively with the right conditions. And so this is a really important way to think about mental health when we talk about how do we address mental health and wellbeing in organisations. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'm not sure if it's the first time some of you are seeing this, but it's an important way to think differently and to recognise that people move through these boxes differently, right? So someone can start in one and move to another, and we're not fixed based on having a diagnosis. We're not fixed to have poor mental health, even if we have a mental illness. Why should we care that people have mental health challenges or there are mental health illnesses that impact at work? Well, because the impacts on the individuals and the organisations are very significant. And so this is drawing from a range of different data sources. So the latest statistics from the ABS say that 1 in 5 employees are likely to be affected by a mental illness. The World Economic Forum in 2017 said that number was more like 1 in 4 will experience mental health challenges throughout their lifetime. So it's very prevalent in your organisations, and so it obviously creates risk. It impacts the way people work. We see in our data from the research we do that employees are much more likely to be disengaged, 36% more likely to be disengaged when they have mental health, financial, or other physical health challenges. And it costs us a lot of money. Organisationally, it's the Productivity Commission estimated it would cost organisations $17 billion per year, but the total cost to society is something more like $180 billion. So the costs are really significant, and they can be very significant within an organisation if the challenges are not addressed. So that's both the challenges of not creating an environment where people who have a mental illness can function effectively, but it's also the costs that accrue where you have an environment where people who don't have a mental illness are not able to cope with the demands of their work. Why do we see people at work reporting mental health challenges? And so when we look at the data, again, this comes from our own research, and some of the data from Safe Work Australia survey in 2014 and 2015, and they found that 91% of workers' compensation, mental health compensation claims were related to work-related stress or mental stress of some kind. And that the underlying reason that mental stress or work-related stress was being reported was most likely to be from two reasons: work-related pressure and work-related harassment. So when we look at what is going on in our organizations that is creating problems for people's ability to cope, whether they have an underlying mental illness or not, there are two factors that the organization has quite a lot of potential to change. Work-related pressure in terms of how the work is designed, how performance is managed, how work is resourced. So there's lots that can be done there with the right will and the right thinking. And obviously work-related harassment is something all organisations are looking to reduce with varying degrees of success in terms of the way leaders and other peers in the organisation behave. When we look at our research from what we do, so this is our global benefits attitude surveys that we run every year. Our data tells us that in Australia, 3 in 10 employees reported experiencing severe stress, anxiety, or depression in the last 2 years. And you'll see when we look across the region, our numbers are the worst. So that's just about, just less than a third. And this was pre-COVID. We will look at the numbers that we're seeing from employees during COVID. But you can see that's a very significant potential drain on organisational performance if we have a third of people who are reporting severe stress. And we know, psychologically, neuropsychologically, the way severe stress impacts the ability of someone to perform over time, the effectiveness of their decision making, their ability to sustain effort, the kinds of choices they make in terms of their diet and sleep and alcohol intake. And so what we can see is that work stress can lead to a range of other poor well-being outcomes for an individual without the right personal and organisational supports behind them. So I've set the scene, hopefully, around what we're talking about when we talk about mental health and why we should care about it. And, predominantly in the organisation, we see 2 presentations of mental health: anxiety and stress. So they're the 2 predominant kind of expressions of poor mental health in the workplace, with the third being, depression. So anxiety, stress, and depression. But well-being is much broader than just mental health. And one of the key guest takeaways that I want to leave you with today is why focusing on a holistic perspective of well-being rather than just mental health is really important, and how it helps you address any mental health challenges, stress, anxiety, depression that you might be seeing in your workplace. So when we talk holistically about well-being, what do we mean? So at Willis Towers Watson, we have developed a model of well-being that looks at 4 interconnected elements. And there are a range of different models out there. Some organizations have developed their own. Unilever have a very interesting model. There's obviously a lot of work that's been done in Canada around the Canadian standard of mental health and wellbeing. Ambulance Victoria have a model. There are a range of interesting models out there that address the question slightly differently. We've looked at this from the kind of components that really matter, and we start with physical wellbeing. Then we look at financial, social, and emotional. So 4 components that we feel are deeply interconnected, and we'll talk about some of the data that we see, but also able to be understood and assessed independently or sort of individually. So physical health, to have strong physical well-being, to thrive physically, means that you understand your own health status. Doesn't have to be very good. You don't have to be the healthiest person in the world, but you have to understand where you are and be able to take the right behavior. So if you have high cholesterol, are you managing that effectively with diet and exercise and medication? So again, this concept that we can have an illness or a deficit, but as long as we are managing that effectively, then we can still have a sense of well-being. So so firstly, we're looking at our physical, and then we think about financial. And this is an element that many organizations have not taken a strong interest in, but it is one of the things that we see is rising very rapidly as a negative impact on mental health when it is, well-being when it is not there. So financial well-being talks about the ability to be financially secure. So that is having sufficient financial literacy and resources to manage your financial commitments, meet your financial goals, protect yourself and your family against risks. And so we can look at people's views about their current sense of their own financial security and their future views about their financial security and what that means for their other elements of their well-being. The 2 final elements are around social well-being. So this is the extent to which people feel connected to other people, how well we interact, how well we feel accepted, and essentially the effectiveness of our interpersonal interactions. And finally, our emotional well-being. So this is our sort of more traditional thinking about mental health, good mental health, resilient in managing stress. We have more positive emotional states than negative emotional states. We generally feel emotionally stable and able to ride the ups and downs of our lives without tipping down into a depression kind of a state. So all of these operate for individuals all the time, but they also have direct expressions inside the workforce. So some of these people bring into the workforce their physical health. They clearly bring with them their financial well-being, although for most people, their organisation is their primary way of achieving financial security. So the organisation has a very significant role there. But social and emotional well-being are 2 elements that people both bring to the workforce in terms of their experiences outside, but also are very significantly impacted by the experience at work. And so this is where often a lot of the work that I do in my sort of talent and reward consulting looks at organizational culture, leadership capability, inclusion experiences to try and enhance the experience of social and emotional well-being of employees at work. Why focus on well-being rather than just mental health, and why those 4 dimensions? So one of the key elements is, while we describe them individually, they operate interconnectedly, and we can see very distinct profiles of impact and experience for people who have different elements of well-being that are operating well or not, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But if we look here at just some of the research we did in our Global Benefit Attitude Survey, around a third of employees report they have both health issues and financial issues. So that's either physical or emotional health issues, psychological health issues, and they have financial stress. And for that group, as a third of people, we can see a range of negative elements in their experience and their performance relative to those people who say they have no issues. So they are much more dissatisfied with their current financial situation. So that's 3 times. They're 4 times more likely to have experienced stress, anxiety, or depression in the preceding 2 years. They're much more likely to be disengaged from their work, 36%. They're more likely to want to work for longer or feel like they need to work longer. So that causes all sorts of problems for talent pipelines and transition to retirement in organisations. They lose 9 more days a year to absence or presenteeism than people who don't have issues. They're much more likely to make poor eating habits and to have low social connection. So you can see when we have 2 elements of the wellbeing not working, we also then tend to have a whole lot of other consequences and impacts in the organisation that are travelling. And so this is where it is really important if someone has, is struggling with their financial wellbeing, to try and make sure that some of the other elements are working well, so that the impact on them and their ability to perform in their organisation is lessened. Or if someone has, is struggling with their emotional well-being, to make sure that some of those other elements work well to try and mitigate the impact of of those challenges on their work and the organisation around them. So if we just look a little bit more broadly, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but you can look, across a range of other factors and the kind of current state, I guess, of well-being in each of these quadrants. So we used to spend a lot of time talking about the poor state of people's physical health, the rates of obesity, the impacts of musculoskeletal conditions, back injuries and other kinds of debilitating illnesses, and the fact that we just generally don't eat enough vegetables and we don't have good nutrition, and these create all sorts of long-term health risks. We see a lot of people in our research struggling financially, and those who are poor financial well-being is very strongly related to poor performance in other areas of well-being. So, and as we said, much more likely to result in people feeling like they can't retire, they don't have sufficient funds in their retirement, they don't have sufficient funds available for them in retirement, and so they'll stay in the workforce. As we know, productivity usually declines somewhat with age. Certainly once we're getting past sort of 70 years, we're not getting the same productivity out of people as we were earlier. So that creates organisational challenges as well. Those who have poor social connection often report high degrees of stress, so about a quarter of them. And similarly, they also report not having strong connection and being able to do things like social-based exercise that a lot of organisations invest in to try and improve the physical health. But those who are not socially connected tend not to engage in those. And finally, on the stress phase, stress is the #1 workplace risk factor from the research that we do in terms of those that organisations say they're most concerned about. So they're most concerned about the levels of stress in their workforce. So that's 75% of organisations we survey, but only about a third of them are really doing something about it. So there's a big disconnect there between people who recognise stress as a very significant problem and organisations that are actively trying to do something to reduce work-related stress. And unfortunately, I'm going to say that yoga and meditation classes are not an effective way to reduce work-related stress. They're fine, they're helpful, but they are addressing a symptom and not a cause. And the work-related stress factors that are driving the bad outcomes will continue to be there. It doesn't matter how much yoga and meditation you throw at people. Just on the last point of data, and we do love our data at Willis Towers Watson. So this is what we see when we see multiple factors operating. And so this again is from our Global Benefits Attitude Survey research. And what we do here is we cluster people into profile groups based on their responses to questions across the 4 dimensions of wellbeing. And so in the first, we have this group on the left, on the right, who have no financial or health issues. That's about 22% of the data set. Then we have those who have only health issues, 28%, those who have financial issues, that's either current or future financial concerns. And then on the right-hand side, combined financial and health issues is about 35%. So the biggest single group in our data have some concern about their financial issues and some concern about health. What you can see here is when we look at the days lost to absence and presenteeism in that group, there's quite a bit of variation. So our best group over here is our no issues group, only losing 13 days. But as soon as we see health issues, we immediately jump up to 20 days. So we additional 7 days lost there. They lose more than the financial issues only, obviously, because there's probably some actual physical health problem that they're dealing with that is causing them to take time off work. But it's less than those who have both financial and health. And so what you can see, once we add two elements together, we are compounding the impacts on the organisations. What's important to recognise is that each of these groups has their own set of kind of lead indicators and lag outcomes. So yes, much more anxiety and depression in this financial and health group. They have lowest levels of engagement, of highly engagement. They're very likely to work past 70, and they have relatively low life satisfaction. Interestingly, those who have just financial issues have better life satisfaction than those who have health issues, but about the same plans to continue to work and about the same rates of anxiety or depression. So that's probably related to the fact that if you have a persistent ongoing health issue, and including a mental health issue, it does really drain your coping resources and tends to impact your overall view about how positive your life is. Whereas having financial concerns is obviously a worry, but otherwise, if you don't have other issues, you can get enjoyment out of your life in a range of different ways. And so this is why we see differences in the life satisfaction effects. So what's really important often here is taking this kind of thinking about who is in your workforce and what their experience is into firstly understanding what that looks like, and then designing intervention approaches and strategy to address the real challenges. I'm going to move just quickly to talk about COVID, because we can't have a conversation without COVID. So what are we seeing in COVID? So this is some of this data comes from the Kaiser Family Institute in the US, and looks at the sort of impacts we're seeing probably when we put this slide together, what was it, April, with some recent updates. So 4 in 10 losing jobs or income, parents with children under 18 have a very significant steeper increase in the negative aspect of mental health. Anyone who has been doing lockdown with 2 primary school children, like I have, can certainly attest to that. It's pretty relentless in terms of what is going on for people in Victoria right now. But anyone who's been having children at home for a long period of time is having significant challenges with that. 45% worry that worry and stress were having a negative impact on their mental health. We have seen reports and data that women are disproportionately more affected through this period. And then we are seeing the really concerning rise in domestic and family violence. So early indications out of China from their lockdown was that they were seeing a tripling of family violence. Our data that we see from natural disasters during kind of states of emergency suggested that family violence could increase between 30 and 100%. And more recent data from the Victorian lockdown shows that calls to the national helpline have seen an increase of about 30%. So sort of chatbot activity is up by about 30%. So people who are already challenged or already vulnerable are experiencing much more significant impacts on their mental health and well-being through COVID than just the average people. But nobody is immune to what is going on. What is going on in terms of what organisations are doing? So the first thing we see is that we recognise this is a global pandemic. It's a global crisis. it has economic and humanitarian elements to it. And so it touches every aspect of our lives, and it touches every aspect of every organization. And so in the past, we haven't really had this kind of experience. Even the financial crises impacted, mainly financial institutions and flow-on effects, ripple effects into other sectors, but not the same kind of widespread impact that we see obviously from COVID and the restrictions placed on all organisations at the moment. So what did we see, and what do we see employers doing? So clearly the big shift was to remote working. 3/4 of people moved to working remotely. Certainly early on, a good proportion of people felt like that didn't impact their productivity. 57% were saying that they felt like they could work as productively as they were before from being remote. But organisations did a lot to try and make sure that would happen. So a lot of effort into communication, a lot of effort into new digital collaboration tools, using social communication channels, upping the role of leaders and managers in engaging with their teams. And so there was a lot of effort from most organisations to do that. And some organisations, although not as many as we might like, about a third in this data set said that they were listening to their employees' experience. So either running surveys or doing some virtual focus groups or using Yammer or Slack or something to engage with their workforce broadly to understand what their experiences were. And the most, I guess, sophisticated of those are doing that on an ongoing way and as the impacts of the environment change. So as they moved into remote working, they would, understand that experience. As they went back to reopening offices and workplaces, they would, engage what the impacts there were. And as we think about, from our perspective, if we ever think about getting through, returning to sort of post-COVID world, what does that look like, and what does the ways of working are going to change through that? So that's where employers were acting. What were employees experiencing? Well, it won't surprise you to hear that almost 90% of employees reported some degree of anxiety from coronavirus, with about 50% indicating a moderate or high degree of anxiety. So if we go back to our earlier slide that said about 30% of Australian employees report stress, high levels of stress, we're seeing that sort of shift up into the 50s during COVID. So a very substantial increase. People feel like they're distracted. So 2/3 say that there's some work distraction due to coronavirus, with just under a quarter saying there's a high level of distraction. And so distraction leads to risk, leads to errors. And so that presents a challenge for organizations. And this is the last area where we've seen the biggest kind of eye-opening, I think, is 70% of people are reporting some new financial concern, 37% indicating a moderate or high degree of worry. That is the one that is increasing. The rest of these have been declining over time, but actually the financial concern that people are expressing is increasing over time. From about April, we saw it increasing until the last data point in July. However, organisations are generally doing quite a good job of helping people cope, helping people find ways to manage the challenges, and about a third of employees are not worried about the risks to their personal health. They feel like their organisation is doing a pretty good job in ensuring that the work locations are safe and clean, but 73% would prefer to continue to work from home. So that is clearly a challenge for many organisations to understand what that future of working is going to look like. It's easy, for people when we're in Victoria in lockdown, you can't do anything differently. But for the rest of Australia and for other parts of the world, as we return progressively to offices, there will be a challenge in convincing people that their commute is safe, that they want to come into the office. And we've seen a range of organisations say, we're not going to go back into offices. We're not going to force people back to offices. We'll expect a very low level of return to work, physical presence in offices over time. And then we've seen some people say, no, you have to be back in the office from this date. So, you know, it's going to be a challenge, and it will certainly have talent implications for organisations as we go forward. And if you're not respecting the views of your people, we would expect there to be, you know, attrition effects because of that. People probably won't be forced to go back to the office if they don't have financial worries. They will make choices that prioritise their own well-being and their family's well-being over being forced back into the office or physical locations. So that's where we are with COVID. It changes all the time. That data set that I just showed you there was from over 500,000 employee surveys that we've run around the world, and clearly it's very different depending on where you are. If you're in Victoria now, you have a different experience to those in Perth. If you're in, you know, somewhere in North America or in Asia, you have your own local challenges that you need to address. And understanding the employee experience actually for us is really core of the work around wellbeing, because wellbeing ultimately is about how people feel. And so really the only way you can get into that view is by asking them and by looking at how that relates to the way they experience the organisation and the kinds of impacts that we see in the organisation. So we do a lot of work with clients, helping them think about well-being as something that exists along a continuum. We talked about sort of our 2x2, but now we're talking more broadly about well-being, not just mental health, but where people are in various states or have a various profile of their own well-being, and we can create an understanding of what the prevalence of profiles are in an organization. So how many people fall into this thriving group who are, you know, performing well on all of the elements of well-being? So they're physically healthy, they're financially secure, they're socially connected, and they're emotionally well. So what group is there? That they are the ones that we want to move people towards. You know, how many people are vulnerable, right? So they're okay on their physical and financials, but they're not doing very well on their social and emotional connection. So they're vulnerable to something going wrong, to not being able to cope, to develop an actual mental illness. To what extent have we got people there? Who are the unhealthy? They may be physically unwell or emotionally unwell. They may have challenges. Who is stretched? And when we think stretched, we're talking here about financially stretched, right? Who looks fine, physical, emotional, social, but financially they're really challenged by their current or their future concern. And then who is in the high risk group? Who's got all four of these things not going well? And clearly that then translates into, what do you do? How do you design strategy and intervention? So we want something to prevent people moving towards the high risk end, and we want to detect early those movements that are happening. So we want to understand the broader employee experience, the organisational health and culture, and the interventions that we build, programs and strategies that apply to everyone. So this is the broad activities that we have that are going to spread across the organisation, that are equally applicable to everyone. And then we will want to look at targeting intervention and detection activities to those people most at risk. So how can we try and identify who's vulnerable or unhealthy? What kinds of activities do we put in place, and how do we target them? Because the challenge with wellbeing interventions is the return on investment comes from those people who are not well, not from giving people who are already well lifestyle supports. And that's why, you know, it's great to have people cycling to work. It's great to support fun runs and corporate games and yoga and meditation, but often you are funding the activity of people who would already do those things and not addressing the real well-being risk in your organisation, which is the people who don't do those things and possibly won't do those things even if you provide them, unless you're going to target and nudge them into that activity much more specifically. Clearly, also, then we have the big gains to be made in preventing people from lodging claims, managing those claims much more effectively, and returning people to productive work as quickly as possible. And along the bottom, you know, we've just identified what the the kind of metric impact of these these groups might experience. And this is conceptual, not data driven. So we've not got data backing these up in deep areas, but we would expect to see, increasing levels of absence, increasing levels of claims, reduced employee engagement and performance and productivity as you move from the thriving to the high risk end. And so what we do often with clients is actually undertake this. So we use employee surveying, a wellbeing survey that we developed to statistically cluster people into these groups based on their responses to questions across the 4 physical, financial, social, and emotional groups. And so what you can get is a profile in your organization of how many people we have who are thriving, how many who are vulnerable, how many who are unhealthy, how many are stretched, and where they sit demographically, organizationally. We don't get down to the individual level because this is obviously confidential data that is being provided. But we can say, look, this part of the organization or these teams really have very poor social connection. And so we need to target some interventions to try and improve the social experience of those people, manager development, more activity to build social relationships. What we can do then, of course, is look at how that impacts performance. And so we can look at their performance ratings, we can look at self-reported performance, and we can identify the kinds of performance impacts that we see depending on, in your organization, who sits in which group. So, what is the percentage people who perform above their usual level? And really what we see is, poorer performance in this bottom group. So 68% perform at their usual, only 24%, more than 24% performing below their usual level of performance, right, in this bottom group, whereas it's only 1% at this top end. And it really depends on obviously how big your organization is and how significant that is. But we also can do this by lining up with other performance metrics. So we can look at certificated and uncertificated absence. We can look at TRIF. We can look at claims of bullying and harassment. We can look at days away from work due to an injury. And we see characteristic patterns. So those with poor social connection take more time off than others after an injury. Those with poor social connection and emotional well-being, so those in the vulnerable, take a lot of uncertificated leave relative to people who with poor physical health who take a lot of certificated leave. And so we can see these consistent patterns in the organisation based on the profile of individuals' well-being. And then clearly what we want to do is craft a way of addressing that. And I'm looking at time and I'm going to keep myself moving along. So the really important thing clearly then is when we're building a well-being strategy is to be holistic. So this is what we're all about. We're all about strategic and holistic action. So we want to act across the 4 elements of the sort of interventions. We want to put in place things that prevent and that enhance people's well-being. So this is largely around to promote positive well-being, to try and move as many people to the thriving end as possible. So from vulnerable to thriving or from unhealthy to thriving. But then if we see people in one of these not thriving groups, we want to be able to identify and intervene early. So we want to mitigate the consequences of poor health for the individual and the risk to the organisation. However, if we've got people who are already unhealthy physically, emotionally, then we need to look at how we help them support. So coping and social support is one of the most critical strategies. And so this is where we're trying to intervene here to support people before they make a claim, even if they are quite far down the sort of poor mental health and wellbeing stage. And then finally, we need to look at, once people are in some sort of claim, some sort of absence, how do we return them to work as effectively as possible? And so a strategy that looks to intervene across the 4 elements, and that it also looks to address issues at different levels of the organisation. And I'm not going to talk you through all of these slides. I've lost some of my formatting somehow through the preparing these. But we can think about what are the things that the organisation needs to do, what are things that we support leaders with, and what are the things that we can help individuals with. And one of the big shifts in the last 10 years has been the proliferation of digital solutions that allow us to go directly to the individual, nudge them, provide them with financial information and advice, obviously digital resilience training and tools. Those kinds of things are really important and can be a valuable part of a strategy, but we can't just focus on changing the individual. We also must look at what is happening at the organizational level that is creating an environment that doesn't support that makes people's challenges worse or creates them in the first place. And that's often the most difficult piece. So if we have organizational design or the way work is done that is creating challenges, then that needs to be looked at. And this is why some sectors really struggle. So the legal sector, to its great credit, has been working on mental health for probably longer than any other sector, but it still has terrible outcomes because the nature of a lot of the work is very high pressured, short deadlines, very client demand driven, and changing the nature of that work is very difficult and has not been cracked yet really by anybody. But a lot of effort is going into supporting people and building resilience and trying to do that. But it is very difficult to understand sometimes how to change the work. This is where I feel automation technology, so I put my future of work hat on for a moment. This is where AI and other kinds of automation technology that can remove dreary, repetitive, non-value adding work from jobs, that frees up capacity inside jobs at the same time as reducing error and cost, could be immensely valuable in creating more wellbeing enhancing work. So I just want to wrap up in a moment and really want to leave you with some of the thinking that we've been doing, coming together from various sides of our organisation as part of Willis Towers Watson, about how we think differently about people risk. And you've probably heard some of this as I've gone through. So the first is that we need to think about this from a people-centric perspective. And so that kind of sounds obvious because we're talking about people risk, but actually that's probably not been the frame and the move and the lens that we see around employee experience, the concept of employee experience and thinking about the employee experience as a way to design an organization does require us to think about the kind of people risk elements differently. So we think about the risk that are posed in the organization from both what exists in an employee outside your organization, so their family situation, whether they've got existing injuries or illnesses, financial concerns or mental health issues that they bring into your organization, and then the things that are generated inside your organization from the culture, experience or absence of inclusion, psychological safety, wellbeing impacts, harassment, health, injury, safety, physical safety, and they all go together to create the potential for risk in your organization. So you can't leave the things that are outside alone and just say, well, it's not our problem. Well, it is your problem because it is contributing to the risk, and you can choose not to do anything about it, or you can choose just to insure against it. But it is not that's probably a less effective way of doing it. You're always going to end up with higher costs just accepting that some risks can't be addressed and can only be insured, when in fact there are things that you can do. So what we have been thinking about doing is really changing the way we work with clients around people risk by starting from the employee experience perspective. And so this is understanding the employee's experience of their own wellbeing and the experience of the organisation that creates that sense of wellbeing at work. And then we can look at the analytics that we do to quantify how that experience is creating risk. So, how many injuries are we seeing? What kind of absence? What kind of turnover? What kind of claims? And what kind of productivity? And then really critically, that helps us understand, how do we act effectively to change? What are we doing across the suite of tools that we have to address, to manage, to mitigate, to ensure against the risks that we're seeing, to try and reduce both the organizational risk profile, but also improve the individual's well-being, because it's a win-win here if we get this right. And this is, I think, where, to come back to COVID, this is where COVID has been quite a significant positive, which is the real focus on the intersection of organizational and employee well-being, right? So we can't have productive, successful organizations if we don't have productive, employees. And so those two things now, I think, have come very much to front of mind and gives us an opportunity to I guess, take things forward in a new direction. So that, I'm sure, is plenty of talking from me. So I can see that there have been a few questions pop up. And so I'm happy to take questions for the last 10 minutes or so.
Okay, Adam, there's some questions that have come up. So two that I might combine. So the first question, and everybody's agreeing, it's a great presentation with great insights. So the first question is about really the employer, and what do you recommend is the best way to reach out to employees in terms of getting to know their current mental health?
Yeah.
Because lots of people don't like to admit that they're having issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So from an employer perspective, but I think the other part of that is, and another question that was asked is, as an employee working with colleagues, how can you help them with their mental health? So I think it's the employer and the employee. So maybe you could answer those together.
Yeah, look, some great questions. And look, so firstly, this is an area, the mental health area is one you enter very carefully. So we don't want people to suddenly start feeling like they need to or are responsible for getting into a conversation around mental health that they're not prepared for. Absolutely, we want to be engaging with people and asking them if they're okay. And I think one of the, certainly in my work experience now with my clients, the first thing everyone talks about when we get on the 50 Zooms we do a day is, how are you going? How's everyone feeling? How are you coping? What's going on in your family? And so we're talking about those issues much more, which is great. But I saw one of the questions talked about stigma. There is absolutely still a lot of stigma about talking about diagnosed mental illnesses. But there are a lot of things that advanced organisations do. So we can do mental health first aid training. So there are organisations that will provide training to people in your organisation to be a mental health first aider. And so again, we don't want everybody just jumping in and starting to say, hey, you look depressed, can I talk to you about your depression, without really knowing what they're doing. So the first thing is, if you're interested, I would definitely look at identifying whether there's an opportunity to get some people trained up as mental health first aiders in your organisation, who can be a resource that a manager could go to and say, hey, I'm really concerned about someone in my team. Can you help me have that conversation? Or that they can be seeing people in the organisation and being able to initiate that. Obviously, a little bit harder now that we're virtual. With some of these things, you can see people struggle in the workplace when you're physically there. And do that. The other thing that we see organisations do is training on to reduce stigma. And so that is a big part of that, is to expose the organisation more broadly to, some of what we've talked about today, that actually mental health issues are very prevalent. They don't mean that you can't work. They actually are just like physical health issues. So, as I said, if you've got high cholesterol, nobody thinks, oh, well, he's got high cholesterol, he might drop dead of a heart attack at any second, because, hopefully that is being managed through the work that you're doing. And just similarly, if you have generalized anxiety disorder, it does not mean that you are incapable of functioning in the workplace, as long as you are, taking medication, if that's part of your treatment, using the skills that you've been taught and actively managing that process. So there is a big part, I think, in those two things that organizations should do when they're starting, which is to say, let's look at getting people skilled up to understand how we can work with our employees, and let's reduce the stigma that people might feel in coming forward. Importantly, when we're doing the surveying, obviously it's confidential and we're managing the data, but we don't ask about mental health issues. We just ask people about their well-being, because it doesn't really matter why they have negative emotions or negative well-being. when we're looking at these things, when we're trying to get a holistic organizational picture. And so we're trying to enter that area quite gently, if you like, without being too intrusive into personal information. So we tend to ask about, do you often feel anxious at work? How frequently, are you happy at work? Not saying, are you depressed? Are you anxious? Do you have a diagnosed disorder? We tend to stay away from those questions. Because obviously that's not really what the organisation needs to know. What the organisation needs to know is creating the right environment to help people who have those situations. There was a lot of Are You OK Day was interesting. There's a lot of differences of feelings about whether Are You OK Day is a helpful thing, and I think it is helpful from the stigma perspective. It's helpful in getting to the individuals and changing their experience. I'm less clear on that one.
Okay, there's great information. It really does make you start thinking about mental health, obviously related to all those other factors, including your general health. And I suppose really the employers need to recognise it in the first instance to be able to put in place a program to help their employees, which was really one of the other questions: how much investment should organisations make, including the managers? So it really, one of those things that starts from the top, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It is absolutely must start from the top. And we've seen some really interesting examples of that. Work with a pharmaceutical organization, and their CEO went out very early on, once everyone had gone from the office, and said, you're going to have extra time in your day because you're not commuting. And when I was hearing this story for the first time, I thought, oh, he didn't go out and say, so I expect you to do a little bit more. He actually said the opposite. He said, I don't want you to add work time to your day because you're not commuting now. I want you to take that time for yourself. And so that sends a really powerful message to the organization about, we care about your well-being. And actually, one of the most predictive questions that we see on high levels of engagement in organizations is where senior leadership demonstrates it cares about the well-being of its employees. And so if you don't have it from the top, you can have the best programs designed in the world, you can have all of the work being done below them, but if people don't see the commitment from the top, it will not land, unfortunately, like everything in organizations.
Yeah, so it's really part of the culture of the business.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of from my perspective, and obviously I have a slight bias here. Culture is a space I work in, but the culture of the organisation clearly has a really significant impact on the kinds of mental health and wellbeing, but also the risks. We've seen financial services royal commissions. We've seen AMP and QBE. We've seen cultural elements of organizations creating risk, as we see in safety and all of these other spaces. And the question is, when we talk about culture, we often kind of are a bit blurry about what we mean, and being clear about what it is in the culture that is driving these things is really important. And that's where, analytics and data and getting the experience of employees and starting to look at that data really critically can be very valuable.
Okay. Well, I think that was a really fabulous presentation. As I said, it really does make you think more deeply about the culture. I think that everybody sits within their organisations and probably trying to influence it a bit in our roles in risk managers and other roles that we might have within the business, because someone has to start the conversation if it's not already begun.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you, Adam, for that, giving us your time today. Also to Willis as the sponsor for the session. And just to remind all of the attendees, and thank you again for your time to attend the session. We have another session at this afternoon, and also the sessions are approved for CPD points with both NEBA and ANZIIF. And if you haven't registered for any of the sessions, you are welcome to do that for tomorrow as well. We have some fabulous sessions tomorrow. So there, if you're interested in becoming a member of the Australasia chapter for RIMS, you can visit our rims.org website for further details, and there'll be also an attendee survey. So let us know your thoughts on the session. So thanks again to everybody for attending, and we look forward to for the next session for your attendance. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Adam.